Came here to talk about applied political economy. So we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you joining us online, thank you very much. Those who are in the classroom, thank you very much. We have finally finished the text, except for one thing we're going to do tonight. And we are going to have a couple of discussions. It's not my intention to keep you all here terribly long, but I do want to cover game theory because I do think it has applications to what you do in this work. I will warn you that if you decide to use it in your work in public administration, be careful because you'll probably be around a lot of people, especially those of higher levels of superiority and rank than you, who have no understanding of what it is. And so they may ask you, what the heck are you actually doing? But it is worth at least talking a little bit about since we covered it in the subject. But we are going to have a group discussion, and I'll explain it here in a second. And then we'll get into the assigned reading, which is Appendix A, and I may find some other subjects. I forgot to add an article. I'll go ahead and tell you. I had a little bit of a family medical matter that came up this past week involving a member of my family that required me to spend an inordinate amount of time in hospitals in Durham. Nothing serious, but more just wasting time and not being near where I needed to be. So I kind of got sidetracked on a bunch of stuff, hence why your podcast assignment got delayed a week and all that wonderful stuff. But I also forgot to give you access to a document that had some links to some additional game theory issues. So I may pull some stuff from there too. And then we'll talk about the week 11 assignment, which you guys are already working on. Or I'm sorry, aren't working on because we're not doing that until the 15th. So let me go ahead and explain what we're going to start off with tonight. So I was teaching, some of you in this class, at least online, know that I also teach public policy analysis on Thursday nights. And we'll more than likely be teaching public policy analysis again in the spring. So if you have to be taking it in the spring, you're probably going to be stuck with me. Sorry about that. As I was teaching, this happened while I was teaching, the chancellor put out an email, which y'all have probably seen now, indicating that as part of Spirit Week, or is it red and white or red and black week? Red and white. I was about to say red and black are Georgia colors, but I know black's part of also of the NC State motif, but just want to make sure. And I'm assuming homecoming Saturday. Okay, that's what I thought. So as part of red and white week, and in light of some unfortunate, sad incidents that have happened here with students this semester already, that they decided to make Thursday a wellness day. Didn't know that until the end of class. And of course, I was telling them about what the class assignment was going to be for next week without knowing that there was not going to be class next week. So I had to make some modifications. But I obviously won't have class for policy analysis on Thursday, but I thought that there might be something that I can do for this class as well. And obviously, you know, the timing of taking this class in association with what's going on in general, and in particular, we're in an election season, can make you think things a little differently, can maybe add or redirect maybe any stress or anxiety that you may have about what's going on and trying to understand it. I would imagine that most people from my experience, most people that are in MPA programs have generally some degree of political mindset. Even if they didn't go into political science in college, they do have some passionate feelings one way or the other. And I'm not asking you to come out and tell us what ideology you are or anything like that. But what I wanted to do was just to start off with class tonight, based on anything that we've covered so far, based on anything that you're seeing and how you're thinking about it in terms of the way the world works, what's going on here in North Carolina, what's going on in the Raleigh area, what's going on nationally or internationally. Is there anything that's stressing you out? And just give you a chance to share it. But I felt like it was important to at least offer this opportunity. So I open the floor to you. I open the floor to the people online. Go ahead. Yes.
So one thing that I thought we were talking about,
Mhm.
and we talked about inflation and interest rates that they kind of adjusted during that period, and it gave some number of between 2008 and 2016 in order to stabilize or reinvigorate the market. They slashed interest rates like 637 times. And so it just gives me more questions. What we're experiencing today, like inflation, like when will there be a cap on that? Does it have to be the extent that we enter a deep start making those decisions?
So excellent point. So what we're experiencing right now with the significant growth of inflation, the rate of inflation has not been this way since the early 1980s. And what happened in the 1970s, and it happened at the start of the 1970s, and it happened a little bit in the middle of the 70s, and then it finished off the 70s this way, was that we had these significant spikes of inflation. In the early 70s, it was a prolonged period that lasted several years. And in the late 70s, it may have lasted longer, except for the fact that the Fed Reserve Chair at the time, Paul Volcker, instituted an extreme policy of raising interest rates to the highest levels we had seen in modern history, which effectively ended it. It caused a lot of other problems too, but it effectively ended inflation. And the example I always like to give was that in the early 80s, my grandmother bought me a CD, certificate of deposit. A year ago, and prior to that, a certificate of deposit, you were lucky to get 1 to 2%. Right now, you can get about 3.5%. At that time, my parents could get 13%, which was unheard of at the time. Of course, at the same time, a mortgage was like 15%. So, which is just unheard of today. The reality is that when it comes to the policies that you have in place to manipulate, to be able to facilitate the reduction in inflation, is that, again, it goes back to that adage, I think I've used it before, that generally speaking, an economist will tell you simply that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. There's too much money out there in the general supply. And we're looking at this at a broad level, global level, macro level. And there are too few goods for it to acquire. And what happens is that in order to restore equilibrium, because of the lack of in order to obtain equilibrium, you got to balance it out. And if you don't have sufficient supply, you've got to reduce demand. The only way to reduce demand is to lower the price. That there have been attempts, as there were by this country in the early 70s, to try to implement price controls. That was attempted during the Nixon administration. It didn't work very well because they only last as long as they last. Once you eliminate them, everything goes back to the way it was. The challenge is, what do you do? And we have to remember that for most everybody here, you've grown up where potentially half of your life, if not more, you've seen this artificially low interest rate. Because as you mentioned in 2008, we lowered interest rates to practically zero. And subsequently, for a very long period of time, we kept interest rates at practically zero at very low levels compared to where they were before. When I was growing up and even into the 2000s, interest rates typically, in most circumstances, were between 3 and 6%. They typically rode a wave in between those two levels. We drop them to zero, we keep them there. And at the same time that the Federal Reserve was doing that, they instituted a practice known as quantitative easing, where what they tried to do to prop up the overall capital market was they recognized that we had this toxic asset, the mortgage-backed security, which had facilitated the crash. And they basically said, well, instead of just letting that asset burn, which would have continued to negatively impact the markets overall, will buy the asset and buy US treasuries. So they turned around, printed money, and bought treasuries that then went out into circulation. And what that did was it provided capital throughout this process. In looking at where that capital went for the last 10, 15 years, most of that capital went to build up the tech sector, the Facebooks, the Twitters, all these industries that have come along, Google. So it had a huge impact on improving the economy in Raleigh, as well as in Silicon Valley and other areas. It also went into a couple of other specific industries, but it did not get evenly distributed. So places like Rocky Mount got hardly any. Then you have COVID. And again, they do what they did before. They crash interest rates back down to zero. They start providing quantitative easing again. And the federal government, this time, even though it had done some of this in the 2008 crisis, but this time, because in response to its policy decision to shut down the economy because of COVID, it felt like it needed to inject capital into the markets or inject money into the markets to offset the loss created by the shutdown. And so it just spent crazy. And what that did was that it did slightly more, but not truly, better distribute the money to the general public because the general public got a share. The problem is that when you do that in the consumer group, you create demand. Giving people money, you create demand. And that's going to lead to inflation, especially if supply can't keep up, and especially worse when supply has been constrained due to the fact that you shut down the manufacturing economy due to COVID. So, needless to say, you'd end up with a situation where we have today, where in the past, a lot of people didn't get any benefit from prior capitalization, increased capitalization, because of how it was distributed. And this time they're getting hammered again, because even though they got money, inflation has grown faster than the amount of money that they got. And it gets back to an issue that is something that we don't talk about as much in public policy, but is something important to think about, in that if somebody's wealth or ability to participate in commerce is dominated by how much they have in currency, they are more exposed to risk than somebody who's not. Which is why having, being able to define wealth in other ways other than how much money you have in your bank account or in monetarily tied investments is very important. How much you have in land, how much you have in other things. And this gets to broader socioeconomic issues. We have a sizable share of our population that their whole worth, for lack of a better word, their income and their acquired wealth is purely cash based. Some of it may be in stock, some of it may be in a few other things, but it's primarily cash based. And that makes them very susceptible to the impact of inflation. And we think about how we live, we typically live in a way where what we do for our paying job is our primary means of producing income or producing value for ourselves. We don't have things that we do, like my grandparents, they gardened significantly and they ate what they grew. You don't have, many people in my family were farmers and actively traded or ate the products that they grew, other than tobacco. And you don't have that kind of diversification. Most people have a job or multiple jobs, they get paid in cash, and that's what they live on. That's me, no question. And so that puts you at greater risk for inflation, regardless of how much money you make, little money you make, because you're susceptible to those demands. So in terms of fixing it, you have to bring them back into equilibrium. What's happening right now is that we're basically using one strategy, which is interest rates. There is also the fact that the Federal Reserve is selling some of its acquired treasury, acquired purchasing, past purchasing of securities out in the market. So they're trying to reconvert some cash. And by doing that, it reduces the money supply and reduces demand. However, that effect in terms of how it affects the overall economy is universal. It doesn't just affect the price of housing, it affects everything. So everybody feels the impact. The other way, and this also happened during the Volcker period, but it was separate from this, and this occurred because you had a transition in political power from Carter to Reagan, from Democrat to Republican, is that there were spending cuts at the federal level. We already know that there's a significant reduction in federal spending because there have been this series of COVID-encouraged one-time legislation that's funded some significant increases in spending. Those are going away. But the question now is what's going to happen to that annual federal budget? And with the election coming up, if certain things happen, that level of spending may reduce. It's a situation, and by doing so, by the federal government spending less money, because the federal government itself is about its total value of GDP is about 16%. The federal government itself is about 16 to 20% of GDP. That's the possibility that could contain it as well. So we have a lot of different things going on. And the key thing is to get it under control, but it will not be a pleasant experience. And then you get into the other question that often comes up in these cases: how much of inflation is true inflation in terms of producer cost prices going up, labor costs going up to increase retail costs, and how much of it is profit taking? That's always a challenge. And it's always hard to figure that out. Like, for example, oil companies, this past couple of weeks, there's been a lot said about oil companies and how much they're making currently because of the price of oil. We also can remember that 2 years ago, they took significant losses. I'm not saying that that justifies one or the other, one justifies the other. I'm simply saying that there is some volatility in their markets as well as with other businesses that we have to take into consideration. Lindsay brings up lack of childcare, lack of workers in general. This is something that nobody has yet been able to figure out. And for those of you who are in similar situations where whether you're trying to access a particular service or you're trying to hire people, I was actually in a conversation with my city manager today, and I brought up childcare specifically. In the childcare case specifically, we know that the supply of childcare pre-COVID was far greater than the supply of childcare post-COVID. There were many childcare providers who went out of business because they were small-based businesses, independent, were not able to do that. People have not entered the field. The nature of childcare as a business operation has changed dramatically over the last couple of generations. There was a time, even if you were running an actual childcare business, not just being somebody who was keeping kids at your home, which has always existed, but if you were running a childcare business, you really didn't have to have any, there were really no regulations. And now the regulations are far more strict, so that it is run first, and this is done for the safety of the child and for their betterment, theoretically, so that they can actually get a curriculum and things like that. But it does put more entry cost on starting the business. And simply put, the situation and the conditions have not revived this. In terms of the worker shortage, there's a couple of different factors to consider, and this is by no means a complete list. First of all, a lot of people left the workforce because of COVID that didn't return. We already know that our workforce in general is aging, that we are not replenishing our workforce with younger people at the same rate we're losing them to people who have reached retirement. there was a tendency prior to COVID that a lot of older workers were extending their participation in the workforce for various reasons. And then COVID happens and they reconsider, they reevaluate, and they decide to leave. So that's part of it. But there's also a lot of other age groups, including the prime working age group, those between their 20s and 40s or 20s and 50s, where participation has gone down as well. And so, as I think I mentioned before, when we look at unemployment rates, the unemployment rate is in a lot of ways deceptive because it only compares those who are employed to the total number of people looking for work. That does not necessarily mean that that's everybody who is able to work or who is in a position to work. It's only those that are looking for work. And what's happened is that participation rate. Thank you.
There's so many applicants, but to look through all the applicants and,
It depends on the job. There are definitely applicants for many jobs. And I would say right now, the situation is that, and I'm going to say this, and it has to do directly with public administration. It's very easy right now that if you're qualified and you're skilled, to find an easy job in certain fields.
Can I say something? Sorry.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I just didn't want to interrupt. I also know that a lot of times in the service industries, I've heard a lot of this kind of rhetoric. I've read articles about it, but I also have personal experiences with people talking about how they realized once they got the relief checks for COVID that a lot of families received, that they were putting themselves at risk for a job that was not paying them a living wage. And I think that brought a lot, especially younger people, I think that brought a lot of things into perspective for people, that they don't want to go back and work a job where they can barely live on it. And then like the check that the government relieved was more than what they'd be going to risk at the times, but with COVID, like their life for, so I think that's also a factor, just like pay in general and how and our living wage and things of that nature.
That's absolutely true. There was a famous fashion model back in the 1990s who used to make the phrase that she wouldn't get out of bed for less than $75,000 a day. That was her going rate for doing photo shoots. But applying it to a smaller scale, even if you're not receiving benefits, when you have an artificial situation, and I don't mean to downplay the living wage discussion. What I mean to say is when you have a disruption, an artificial disruption such as COVID, and we choose as a matter of policy, understandably so, to provide money for these people. And like, for example, in North Carolina, the average check that people was getting was greater than the average weekly wage. I think it was like 102% or something like that. The reality is that people, first of all, have more money. And second of all, they have opportunities, as Keston mentioned, they have time to consider what they're doing. And for a lot of people, including those that were working in the hourly service industry, whether it be in restaurants, hotels, and if you come to Eastern North Carolina, several areas of unskilled manufacturing, the reality is that they realized that they felt, regardless of what the market would bear, I would say, not just what the market would bear, but regardless of the market would bear, they felt like they were worth it. And what's also happened is that you have this disruption in the industry where people realize that they might be able to get by doing something that's different. We have, like, for example, right now we have a need for physical labor in our street department and our stormwater department. And this it starts out as being unskilled labor. There's no other way to put it. But we pay for these employees more than $15 an hour, and we provide health insurance and retirement. So this is for somebody who may be a high school dropout, or somebody who may just have a high school education and has no idea what they want to do. This may be a good entry point job for them. I don't know if many people would want to do it for more than 3 or 4 years, but it's an entry. And I'll get to a second, but the reality is that these same individuals can also go work can all work 30 hours a week for DoorDash and Uber Eats and probably make the same amount of money. And when you're between 18 and 21 years old, I was the same way, chances are you're not thinking about health insurance or retirement. You're thinking about making sure you got enough money to pay your bills. Now, if you're thinking about health insurance and retirement, good for you. You should be. But many people that age don't, historically. So the reality is that we got to figure out a way to meet these demands. Yes.
I was just gonna say, like, another shortage that's kind of becoming like more and more relevant is like the shortage of like workers to like work like the different like roads and stuff. Because I was listening on the radio a couple days ago. The shortage that exists like when it comes to like road construction projects.
For projects that take forever.
Yeah, that's why like even like close to me, there's like this was like a road renovation project. This is like
So the issue with road construction, and it ties into the point that Abby made with respect to local government, is that a lot of times those same projects were bid in like 2 years ago or a year ago, and those were set price. And so those set prices were based on a forecast that vendor made on what they thought the labor rate was going to be at that given time. So they're faced with a conundrum because they can't pass, those are locked in contracts. In fact, so they've got an issue. Most of the contracts that are now done at the state and local level have penalties if they're not done within a certain time frame. So they're under a real situation. They can either take a hit in their profit or lack thereof by raising wages to be able to get the workers, or they end up having to pay a penalty to the state back to cover those costs. So they're maybe in a situation where they're losing money either way, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. And local government, it gets back to what I brought up as a question about easy work and everything else. There are a lot of ways for people out there to make good livings doing easy work, especially work that does involve interacting with people, having to deal with conflict, or having to deal with circumstances that are outside of your control. And there's a lot of people who are people are going to likely do that which makes them the most comfortable and is the easiest. That's how most people are. That's humanity. And that creates another challenge for local governments and for other employers like us, because our work, you have to resolve conflict, you have to interact with people, and you deal with circumstances beyond your control. The same is also true in education with teachers. The same is also true in the medical field to some extent. Right now, the issue we have a serious issue trying to recruit and retain police officers. And for a police officer, first of all, it's finding those who want to be police officers. But then amongst those who want to be police officers, it's where are they going to work? What city they're going to work? What's the profile of the population of the city they're working with? Do you work in a suburb of Raleigh? Or do you go to somewhere that has different issues? And that can be a challenge in itself if they're paying about the same. And of course, that means that a city like us that perhaps is less able to pay people actually has to pay a premium to provide those officers. Same we have to do with teachers as well. Tim said construction manager. Okay, Lindsay, I'll get back to you in a second. Had a construction worker manager tell me that once he needed two things: marijuana legalization, immigration reform, then he would have enough workers. I would agree. He probably has more chance of getting the first than the other. I will go ahead and tell you, in the labor industry, anything that in the current situation, the fail rate for a marijuana test is about 50%. That's the standard, and it's higher in some areas. Legalization is the first step, but then if in order to address that, the first step is legalization, and then it's getting the insurance companies to say, okay, we're okay with this. Because even if it's legal, they still have to remember this person could be driving a forklift or driving a car or something like that. And obviously there's a different way that it's treated than alcohol and other drugs. That's a long-standing issue that's not going to change itself overnight.
I guess that was just having to the drug screenings as well, you know, with employment and, you know, those that are the hiring process.
Decriminalization would be a definite good first step. Before we do everything else, decriminalization. I'm going to get her first and then you go ahead. Say again?
It was what's.
Yeah. Go ahead.
We're hitting on like a lot of labor.
Yes, we are.
So my question here, I guess. With iridectomy, like there's none of that bad boy still left in there. And so.
Carol, you're sorry.
That's so, it was like, I was 21, right? The average age is like what, like 80, I don't know. So that was my life where I have to take a medicine or I will die in a month. Like if I
Right.
don't take it for a month, I still have to pay for it. And I just saying you have to pay for stuff, but I'm like, I will literally die without. I don't have.
It's a challenge because we are now, a generation ago, we didn't think these things were possible. A generation or two ago, we didn't think these things were possible. I mean, it's like when I was a kid, and that's just, my wife and I talk about this all the time because we grew up in the 80s and 90s. At that time, AIDS was a death sentence. HIV itself was a death sentence. AIDS, of course, was automatic. And of course, now you can watch TV commercials and you can be HIV positive and you can live a practically normal life just taking a basic medication. And thyroid issues, multiple sclerosis, a whole host of things. In the last 10 years, there's been this dramatic expansion of medicine in these fields, which have dramatically improved quality of life, enabled for the once life-threatening situation to be manageable, extend periods of life. We have people at the city who are dealing with MS. And because of this medication, we're not having to put them on disability retirement, which is normally what would have happened 5 years ago, was they would go on disability retirement and maybe have a 5-year lifespan after that. Now they can still work their jobs and hopefully go on for a very long time. But there's a cost to that. And these medications, unfortunately, the challenge with these medications is that while they are very beneficial and valuable, they do not have as broad of a client base, thankfully so, as other medications. And so the drug companies are faced with a challenge in terms of managing their overall product in terms of how much they charge for these. And the insurance companies themselves have not caught up like they should to looking at the benefits of providing this service at either at a reasonable price or as part of the incumbent coverage. And these are challenges that are going to have to be addressed because, you know, for like 10 years ago, our concerns were diabetes and smoking related illnesses, heart disease, lung cancer. Those were the big killers in our society. And we're starting to see that smoking related illnesses are going down because smoking rates have diminished. And that group that was there are aging out. Diabetes has been more managed and controlled. We have still a lot of people who deal with it, but it can be managed and controlled. But now we have these other things that are coming up, which have always existed there. But in the past, somebody, if they found out that they had it at 30, may live to see 40. And that'd be about it. We can outlive to normal expectancy, but there's a cost to it. And we got to figure out how to build that into it. And it gets down to trying to figure out how to do it. And I don't have an exact solution. I wish I did. I think as employers, we have to think about it because we have that responsibility to our employees. We're a self-insured entity where I work, and so we make sure that that's available to our employees. But it still comes with a cost. And that cost is not going to change regardless of who pays for it. It can be shifted, redistributed, adjusted, but the cost is still the cost. So we got to figure out how to handle that. Yes.
Is how technology like society, and then like what I've learned in my media economics class is just how organizations, as we globalize, have sought to become more lean. Marketing, like highly specialized, highly educated kind of workforce here, and where manufacturing, all of those like it's like sent abroad.
Outsourced, yeah.
Right, they're outsourced. So I feel like that's a major contributor also to the labor shortage because it's like large. It's like highly skilled positions and those that aren't where we kind of like have.
Yeah. There was this, so when this generation of technology started in the late 90s, there was this belief in the people that were advancing it that they thought what was going to happen was that it was going to lead to this rapid decentralization. And they thought what was going to happen was they thought that it was going to create more choice and more disbursement of talent, of resources, and what the case, because they thought they could scale operations smaller and still achieve efficiencies necessary to achieve profits. The opposite happened. And so as a result, let's use North Carolina as an example. Because of the investments that this state made in the late 50s and the early 60s to build Research Triangle Park and establish it as a hub for what was then considered advanced manufacturing. I mean, now it's not, but it was then. And that continued growth and development over a 50-year period, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill were in a prime position to take advantage of what's happened the last 20 years. And you see that everywhere. And it's been great for Raleigh. It's been great for the Triangle. It's been great for the state. There are growing pains, there are challenges, there are inequities for certain. But I mean, I've lived here in this area 16 years and started coming here regularly 20 years ago. And this area is far different than it was back then. And I can say the same about where I grew up, Nashville, Tennessee. The challenge is that if areas were not prepared for it through policy or through existing industry or whatever, they were on the losing end. So you have a place like Rocky Mount, which was agricultural and heavily reliant on agriculture, cash crop, traditional cash crops, and low skilled to unskilled manufacturing, textile industry. And there really was not an infrastructure in place to transition that community, not provided locally and not really facilitated by the state. And so starting in the mid to late 90s, continuing through the 2000s, Rocky Mount saw those industrial sectors, which had been the predominant employers, basically vanish. We still have some agriculture. And what's happened is that when you're trying to recruit new industry to Rocky Mount, because the two things, we've got plenty of land, we're on a railroad, we're close to Raleigh, there's a lot of attributes that work to our advantage. But then it comes to labor. And the fact is, we don't have, in our case, the educational infrastructure to, I'll say it this way, we have the ability that if you tell us, hey, I need people in 9 months to learn, like say 8 skills, we can do that. We have the capacity to be able to do that. We can do that for employers. But if you say to them, if an employer says to us, I need people who have some degree of adaptive, creative thinking, or can adapt to situations and work with modern technology and be able to be intuitive in its approach, we don't have the ability to create that supply. Those who are created out of our system are likely going to go somewhere else. And that's true in our community. That's true in a lot of communities around Eastern North Carolina. And what that means is, like, we're focused on trying to get a battery plant, trying to get the technology. And we got a lot of natural resources and logistical advantages that could facilitate that. But we realized that if, like, say, we needed 3,000 workers for one of these plants, more than likely, we may be able to fill locally about a third to a half of them. The rest of them are going to have to come from other areas. And so that puts us at a disadvantage. And so what these operations have not been able to, they've continued to need that massive scale. In other parts of the world, particularly in East Asia, you have countries that have built up basic skill levels and have adaptive programming. They have the resources and they have large populations that they need to have. And so they're able to, and the government provides some degree of benefit to them that it's not totally dependent upon their salary in some cases. And so they say, come here, we'll build your factory, give you the resources, you have laborers, you have controlled wages, it's golden. And these companies are still publicly traded companies, so they're trying to maximize profit input for them. I'm gonna go to him and I'll come back to you. Yes. You had asked to ask a question. I want to make sure I got back to you.
It was like on a topic we were talking about a long time ago. So
Okay, cool. You had a follow-up.
So yeah, I'm just thinking, I'm from
You're from where?
Eastern.
Okay,
I'm from
got it.
So.
So I'm sorry for, I apologize. I know you've seen it yourself, so.
Yes, that's why I'm in the APA program. Understanding social issues and institutional events. But I'm thinking about community college and how central they are, because where I'm from, not everybody or most people don't go to school.
Right.
They're not even really positioned in a way that they understand how to get there. So to me, there's such an important role for community colleges. On whether or not community college within Eastern North Carolina needing this trade understanding from that community. You think about like the Toyotas kind of framework of being able to plug, it's kind of like you can plug people into whatever they're for investments in industries, especially in like clean energy. There's like a lot of solar farms and electric vehicle type of things coming, but
Yeah, before I moved here, it was hard for me to understand North Carolina's approach to education, to higher education. Tennessee's approach is we don't try, so there's these things known as public Ivies. And Chapel Hill's one, State's almost one. And it seems to me that over the last 50 years, with the exception of some improvements in building a medical school in Greenville, North Carolina has basically focused its intention on building up 2 universities. Whereas in Tennessee, we don't want a public Ivy. Even UT Knoxville is not a public Ivy. Its most recognized program is in forensic pathology. It's got a good vet program, a good law school, and it's good programs, but in terms of world class, we're known for developing medical exams. So all the universities in Tennessee, everything is a regional approach. And funds are distributed that way. And the community colleges are built that way. And they actually keep the trade schools out of the community colleges. They actually have more trade schools than they have community colleges. We have a ton of trade schools. Here in North Carolina, the first thing that bothers me is that most kids are not exposed to trades until they're out of high school. Most of the counties here do not have trades programs. We just started one in Nash County, but it's in a separate school. They took an old high school and set it up as a trade school, which is great, except that again, that kid is basically having to make a decision at 14, 15 years old. Do I go college track or do I go trade school? You don't really want them to have to make that decision at that age. You want them to be exposed to that. And then, so they're not, so in most places in North Carolina, they're not exposed to trades at 15. So they don't know how they're not sure what they can do. And we don't do a very good job in terms of developing kids of really talking about the community colleges. And generally speaking, our community colleges do pretty well with the students they get. There are some very good programs. And I mean, our healthcare industry in North Carolina is basically dependent on it, because they pretty much run the nursing programs. There are some universities that have nursing programs, but most of them are run out of community colleges. And so the challenge we have is, one, preparing them for community college, because we don't want them to be in a remedial situation, which unfortunately happens too much. But also making them aware of it. And I think this is something the legislature and the governor should consider, making it easier that kids can pay for it financially. I don't know if I would go straight up free, but definitely creating some kind of financial program that makes it pretty much guaranteed that if you can't pay, you get it. I definitely think it's helpful, because what we realize is a high school education in today's world is not sufficient for any type of what we used to call gainable employment. So we realize that. Anybody else?
Lindsay talked about, this is right before Aaron started talking, Lindsay mentioned about healthcare workers, and the shortage of healthcare workers. And I know at like, for example, for me, like the senior living communities, like burnout after burnout.
Well, and especially because healthcare workers, along with several other particular disciplines, were basically put into a bad situation for the last 2 years. Everybody else was told, don't stay home. I mean, everyone was told to stay home, and healthcare workers, along with several other public sectors and certain industries, were said, no, you gotta work. You don't need, you're working double, you're doing whatever you have to do. And it was not an appropriate situation. And that's a serious issue. And also in terms of healthcare in general, the supply is not enough to meet the demand. So those who graduate out of those programs, particularly those who would be seen as the ones that you would want to see working in the healthcare field, they're going to have their choice of where they want to go. So they're going to be able to pick the best opportunity for them. But it may not necessarily align best to where the need is. And so issues like senior care, other areas of care where there's a strong need for these workers, don't get them because they're not as attractive of locations. And so we have to figure out, how do you offset that? How do you incentivize people to take those opportunities? And this is also, I mean, like I said, this is true in teaching. This is true in a lot of fields, in the public sector especially, or with respect to public needs, where it's going to have to be, how do we encourage people, particularly those that may have greater private sector opportunities or greater opportunity, more freedom of choice in their opportunities to consider these opportunities. And yes, JR is right. Baby boomers themselves, this is something that's been ongoing, that we have this generation, for many of us, it's our parents or grandparents that are now at the point where they're going to retire. They extended it. I'm working for a 73-year-old right now, but they're ready to step aside, and that's a challenge too, because it's not just the fact that you've got to replace them, but there's going to be a loss of institutional knowledge and other aspects and things that they have. Not miss the fact that my boss still prefers green bar sheets to a spreadsheet, but you know, go with that. Green columnar pads. You know what a columnar pad is? So back in the old days before spreadsheets, when you were doing financial work, you would get what were called columnar pads. And these were like pads of paper that were like read out like a ledger. And you would fill in information so that you could keep the numbers separate from the text, and you would write everything out. Basically, it's spread. He still does.
How does he share it?
Makes a copy, and then one of us eventually puts it into Excel. He's doing a great job. Let me be clear. He's helped. Yeah.
Doubling.
He's it's been an interest. It's a transition for me because I started my professional career in the late 90s when we were still, like I think I mentioned this class, we were still using DOS programs before. This was pre-Windows stuff, green screens, those type of things that you may have heard of or seen. And of course, everything has changed so dramatically. And of course, office behaviors, like previous managers would do dictation. They wanted to speak into a cassette and have the secretary type it out on and of course now you can do that yourself if that's how you prefer. But most of us who grew up now, we can type faster than we can talk. So it's a whole different thing. And when the texting generation comes along into executive roles, I don't know what's so.
You talking about us or the one after?
The one after you.
Oh,
I wouldn't say all. That. Now, 10 years from now, I got to remember that. I'll have to say, no, it's the next one. But we'll make sure about that. Okay, anything else? So let's get into game theory. We covered this. We kind of touched on it a little bit earlier in the semester. And I hope Appendix A gave you some additional information. There's some references. This will not be on the exam, just to let you know. Because I am not qualified to evaluate that. But if this is a subject that interests you and that you find applicable in your future work, it is something good to learn about. What you're really dealing with here is that in most situations, and this is especially true in public policy, each individual has the potential to act different or act similarly. And you don't exactly know how each person is going to act. And so when, for say, you're developing a new program in the public sector, like you're trying to figure out, we know like a community sees this growth in population, like let's say we're Mooresville. And we know that this population is growing, it's more affluent. They're coming from other parts of the country. They are probably used to playing additional sports that we're not used to here because North Carolina is basketball, baseball, and football, basically in that order. We kind of have a tendency, we're trying to figure out what people want. And we're trying to say, so we want to start a youth sports program that's going to be of high interest to our residents. And we only have enough money to do one program right. But let's say you had three options. You had lacrosse, you had rugby, and you had cricket. If you know anything about Mooresville, you know that they actually are investing in one of these programs right now, significantly. But, and you're trying to figure out, you've got a population, you might have some demographic information, you may have some particular information about what parts of the country or world they come from, but you still don't exactly know what they're going to be interested in. Which one of those three? You know it's going to be one of those three. One of those three is the right answer, but you don't necessarily know which one is the best. And so you have to figure out, to the best of your ability in recommending a sport, which one that the city should go in providing a program. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to deal with the situation that we often that's referred to in here, and it's on page 337. Dealing says most interesting situations are situations of strategic interdependence. That is situations in which the outcome for one person depends not only on their own behavior, but also on the behavior of others. So what you're trying to figure out is you're trying to figure out the example that based on how a core group would respond, other people will follow. So that not only do you get the people that are most interested in it, but that other people will say, you know what, that's interesting. Because you may pick an option where a core group's interested, but nobody else wants to do it, like in an event. So, I mean, that's kind of, that could be the case. Game theory is a powerful and flexible tool that can be used to study quite complicated strategic environments with many players, asymmetric access to information, a variety of kinds of uncertainty, and so on. Our purpose here is to learn just enough to grasp the social dilemmas and governance challenges that are at the core substantive concerns of what we've been talking about, behavioral economics. So what you're trying to do is, first of all, what you want to try to understand is this concept of utility function. And this is where you look at your options and you basically would rank them in a certain order, that each individual participant, i.e. citizen or family, as the case may be, has a preference in terms of these activities. So let's say it was rugby, lacrosse, and cricket, that they're going to rank one of those one of those two, and one of those three. And even if there are lesser degrees of preference between them than others, they're still going to rank them. And you have to figure out kind of what's the best option and then take into consideration other factors. But also understand that there are the potential for risk and that these risks have uncertain probabilities. The example it gives in the book on page 338 and 339 is about, do you decide to take an umbrella with you if you think it's going to rain, if there's a chance, if there is a chance of rain. You could choose not to take an umbrella and it doesn't rain and there's no problem. You could take an umbrella and it rains and again, no problem. Then the other two options is, or you could take an umbrella and there's no rain, again, inconvenience, but not a huge problem. But then the worst case is if you don't take an umbrella and it does rain, that can be bad. But it's not necessarily bad for everybody the same way, because some people don't mind getting a little wet, other people are like the Witch and Wizard of Oz. So there are different factors that you have to consider. And so when we have to look at these alternatives, and so we realize this probability is out there of rainfall, and we have to come up with these alternatives, and we call these lotteries, and it's a probability distribution over various possible outcomes. And so without getting into it too deep, we have to kind of think about the probability, because trying to think of it mathematically doesn't always work, because you're never going to have necessarily the time to do it. But you have to say to yourself, what is the probability of something happening? So, for example, given that we have three different sports, The three sports have different requirements in terms of field access, in terms of accessibility of people who know the sport, equipment cost, and so on. And the probability of other factors such as domestic acceptance of the sport, international acceptance of the sport, and also how they do in rain. Can you play the game and can you play the sport in the rain or not? You have to play it, can you play it at night? Can it be played with lights? Do you have lit fields? Can it be played at night with lit fields? Some sports can't. You have to think about those because it affects the probability of it being successful. Because ideally what you want is the ideal result is the most popular sport with the easiest implementation and less chance of problems or hindrances. But you've got to figure out how to reach that. And so that's where trying to factor the probabilities are there. And these are hard to come up with mathematically, necessarily. They're hard to come up with mathematically, but they can be developed qualitatively or quantitatively without using numbers. So one way of doing this that they talk about in here is what's known as a strategic form game. That allows you to be able to take this information of figuring out probabilities to determine payoffs or in a model that'll work, that'll allow you to figure things out. And there are three components to a strategic form game. You've got the players. In this case, that would be the population you're trying to serve. You got the strategies, which are the strategies each player or a list of things that they can do in the game. And if we look at them as a group, which would be considered a profile, the collection of those, the profile of strategies would be known as an outcome, which is what it leads to. And then you have the payoff, and that is looking at each player's preferences over the set of possible outcomes. Of course, the goal is to try to have as many people as possible achieve a positive outcome. Maybe not the most positive outcome, but to achieve a positive outcome across the widest distribution possible. So it's not necessarily that it's going to be the option that is going to get the highest score for the most people, but it's the case where where the largest group has a positive outcome. And that's what we try to achieve. Are there any questions at this point? Yes. Yes, very much tied to utilitarianism. There's a lot of economics that really looks at the issue of utility. And in fact, the podcast that y'all will report on next week for the assignment really gets into this to some degree, looks at it from a more modern context, but it is very much a utilitarian approach. So the American economist John Nash, who was featured in the movie A Beautiful, his story was featured in the movie A Beautiful Mind that came out about 10, 15 years ago, came up with this idea in terms of applying game theory known as the Nash equilibrium. It is a strategy profile that meets a particular condition. Intuitively, a strategy profile is a Nash equilibrium if no individual has a unilateral incentive to change their behavior. And what this means is that the strategy profile, the collection of strategies, tells us which individual will do. This profile becomes a Nash equilibrium if each individual is taking an action that leads to an outcome that is good for them as possible, holding all other players' behavior fixed. So what that means is that what everybody else does, they still get the best possible outcome. Which can be a challenge. the way that this was explained in the movie when Nash, trying to describe how Nash came up with this idea, and I apologize for some of you probably, has anybody seen the movie? Anybody online seen A Beautiful Mind? Yes, pro Jennifer Connelly.
My favorite movie ever.
Say again?
I said yes, it's actually my favorite movie.
So you'll remember this description, and I apologize in advance because it's a little dated. So he's in a bar with these two other gents at college. They see this attractive woman. They see I'm sorry. Was there two or three? There were two of them. There was one attractive one. There was one attractive woman. Now I remember correctly. There's one attractive woman. And as a group, they're all trying to decide who should go up and introduce themselves. And Nash starts playing through it as he did. And he figures out that what they all should do, honestly, is not approach her and find three other women in the bar and each approach them. That in a way, they would all achieve their goal and they would all benefit the same. And problem, because they were all jealous with each other over this one person, they would all take care of the jealousy issue. And then each of the three of them would have a better chance of being able to strike up a conversation with this woman, with the woman they were choosing. And the third person, the original person, wouldn't matter in the equation. They would find somebody else. And that is the idea that sometimes the appropriate choice is not the obvious choice in a given situation. Gets back to the idea in public policy that we talk about in policy analysis, the theory of the second best, where most of the time when we do policy implementation or recommend policies, we typically don't recommend the best policy. And the reason why is that while it may be advantageous to some people or even to a majority of people, the chances are it's disadvantageous to a large number of other people as well. It creates conflict. And so you try to figure out another solution that is more accepting to a broader group of people and is also more feasible. But it's a great movie. I will warn you, Nash's story is very complex. He was a genius, and with genius comes madness. In many cases, history has proven that. He dealt with schizophrenia, and it talks a lot in the movie about that. But overall, it's a very positive tale. Ron Howard directed it. It's a good movie. The reality is that the idea we're trying to push here is that there is a way to try to forecast, estimate to some degree how people will respond and be able to figure out the best solution. And what this does is it has some advantages. It can create stability. Also is self-enforcing, and it also keeps analysts humble. Talks a little bit in there about that. The way it says in the last paragraph, while it is not possible to imagine situations where the analyst believes that they know things about the game players in the game don't know, as a general matter, this seems a strange assumption. After all, you are just sitting around solving the game. The players are living it. Who do you think you are? So it's always important for us to remember, and I think this is very important given some of the challenges we're facing in general in public policy today, that, I think I've said this before in class, and I know I've said the other one, you obviously many times will be in a position where you will know more, totally understandable, and that's probably the case. Never going to a decision knowing that you know better, because that's when problems arise. That's always a challenge. There's plenty of good information with respect to Nash equilibrium online that goes into it in great detail. And it's certainly something you should look into as well as in general election. So our next class will be next Tuesday on November 8th. None of this stuff is in the book. I have put it into the class folder on Google Drive already, but we will be we'll be going back and looking a little more at behavioral economics. The podcast that we will be talking about next week delves into this a little bit as well. This is a growing area of the economics field. The folks over at Duke do a lot of work in this area. And in terms of its application to public policy, it's very important because there's a lot of assumptions in traditional economics that don't necessarily play out when they're actually applied in society in terms of how people think and what people actually do, compared to what we think they're going to do. Also, we will get into another discussion which has become more pertinent the last couple of years, and that is this concept of modern monetary theory. And I do think it's important because it is something that is being talked about, and it's actually being applied, and we're seeing some of the impacts and externalities of it. We talked about that a little bit with inflation, but it is something to understand at a basic level because, particularly in your work, if you work in government, this is something that's going to come up and something that y'all need to be aware of. We also, as I said before, podcast assignment 3, I sent the link out before class. That's due next week by 6 o'clock. The group project assignments, the materials are due by 6 p.m. on the 15th, and then we'll do the presentations in class. Did I schedule that for Zoom or in person?
So I was actually talking to them earlier about what
Yeah.
it was. So it says in class via Zoom. So that's what I was trying to.
Let me look at that for a second.
Yeah, see.
So I said classroom and Zoom. So what that means is you can choose either way. And the groups can also be blended. So it does not mean that the whole group has to be here as long as you work it out. All right. Are there any questions? Okay, everyone, thank you so much, and I will see you all next week. And also tomorrow, next Tuesday is election day, so don't forget to vote.